Bitcoin is entering one of its most heated internal debates in years, and for many investors, it feels like the early signs of another civil war inside the network. Now, it starts as a technical disagreement over node software, has turned into a larger, important conversation about censorship, decentralization, and the long-term direction of Bitcoin itself. Right now, the tension centers on whether users should run Bitcoin Core, the long-standing default software, or Bitcoin Knots, an alternative that filters certain types of transactions. This isn't a protocol change, and it hasn't created a fork, but it has raised concerns about how nodes can handle data and whether Bitcoin could fracture if this escalates. For investors who were around during the 2017 Bitcoin Cash split, the tone of this debate may feel familiar. Back then, disagreements about block size led to a full chain split, new coins, and years of community division. Today's argument isn't there yet, but the emotional energy and ideological differences echo that period. The key point is that decisions made now can shape Bitcoin's future for decades. Which node software people choose to run influences how transactions are relayed, how censorship-resistant Bitcoin remains, and how scalable the network can be. These choices affect not just today's market, not just the price, but how future generations interact with Bitcoin, the actual network. It also affects how governments perceive it, and how they might want to interact and control it, and how sustainable it remains as a global monetary network. If this kind of clarity helps you navigate deeper Bitcoin topics, you can learn even more at learningcrypto.com. So Bitcoin Knots is a full node implementation that branches from Bitcoin Core, but gives users more control over how their node behaves. It's essentially an alternative version of the same software, still enforcing all core Bitcoin rules like the 21 million supply cap and proof of work, of course, but with added customization options for those who want tighter control over what their node accepts or relays. The main purpose of Knots is to reduce blockchain bloat by filtering out what it considers non-monetary data, such as ordinals, NFTs, and other inscription activity that fills block space without contributing to everyday Bitcoin transactions. Supporters argue this keeps Bitcoin efficient and preserves its identity as electronic cash rather than a general-purpose data storage network. Knots is maintained primarily by Luke Deshire, one of Bitcoin's longest tenured developers, known for focusing on privacy, security, and spam prevention. Now, while Knots represents only a minority of node operators today, it has gained more attention among users who feel that the rise of inscriptions has pushed up transaction fees and strained the network. Importantly, Knots is fully compatible with Bitcoin's consensus rules. Running it doesn't create a new coin or fork the network. Instead, it simply lets individual users apply stricter policies on their own node, influencing what data they personally accept or propagate. Bitcoin Core and Bitcoin Knots both enforce the same fundamental rules that define Bitcoin itself, including the fixed 21 million supply, proof of work consensus, and all protocol level validation. The difference lies in how each software handles transaction policies and node level customization. Bitcoin Core is maintained by a broad group of contributors and takes a conservative approach to change. Its priority is stability, predictable behavior, and preserving consensus across the global network. Knots, on the other hand, is primarily maintained by a single developer, again, Luke Deshire, which gives it more flexibility to introduce experimental features and stricter filters that advanced users may want. One of the biggest distinctions involves spam filtering. Core allows a wider range of data to be included in transactions, including larger OP return fields that inscriptions rely on. Knots give users tools to reject or limit these data-heavy transactions, helping reduce blockchain bloat and keep resources manageable for long-term node operators. In terms of user focus, Core aims to support the broadest possible user base place with minimal friction, while Knots appeals to users who want tighter control over how their node stores and relays data. Core's wallet and resource tools stay within consensus norms, whereas Knots adds additional features for efficiency, wallets, and policy controls. Now, none of this changes the protocol. Both versions accept all valid Bitcoin transactions. The controversy arises because Knots allows nodes to selectively relay or not relay certain transactions. Supporters view this as optional customization, but critics see it as a path toward subjective censorship. The debate around Bitcoin Knots has intensified because it touches on foundational principles: what counts as spam, who decides that, and whether filtering threatens Bitcoin's neutrality. And there's a big indication that it does. Supporters argue that Knots protects Bitcoin's core purpose, while critics warn it could set a precedent for censorship. Pro-Knots voices focus on efficiency. They argue that filtering inscriptions reduces block space congestion, helps keep fees manageable, and prevents the blockchain from becoming a storage layer for arbitrary data. For them, Knots empowers users to run the network in a way that prioritizes monetary transactions without forcing protocol changes on anyone else. They see this as decentralization in action. Now, on the other hand, critics such as Andreas Antonopoulos warn that filtering transactions, no matter how well-intentioned, introduces subjective censorship. What one user calls spam might be legitimate to another. They argue that once node operators start filtering at this level, it opens the door for regulators to demand additional filters, ultimately weakening Bitcoin's resistance to outside pressure. They also raise concerns that large-scale adoption of Knots could fragment transaction propagation and create social division similar to past disputes. The broader context is that Bitcoin has no central authority. There is no final decision maker. The ecosystem evolves based on what individuals choose to run. That's why this debate feels so significant, because node choices today can and will influence how the network behaves tomorrow and further down in the future. To understand why today's Knots debate feels so tense, it helps to look back at what happened in 2017. At that time, the Bitcoin community was divided over how to scale the network. One side wanted to keep smaller blocks to protect decentralization. The other wanted larger blocks to fit more transactions. When the disagreement couldn't be resolved, the network split. Bitcoin remained on the original chain, while dissenters created Bitcoin Cash with bigger blocks. Now, for investors who weren't around then, the outcome was dramatic. Anyone holding Bitcoin automatically received an equal amount of Bitcoin Cash, which created short-term excitement, but also confusion and volatility. The fork fractured the community, diluted Bitcoin's brand, and forced the network to spend years reestablishing unity and clarity around its purpose. So the lesson from 2017 is that forks tend to emerge when philosophical or technical disagreements reach a breaking point. They can offer short-lived financial upside, but also come with long-term risks, like reduced network effects, weaker security, splintered liquidity, and unnecessary complexity for new users. The industry is still living with those side effects today. So the relevance of the current Knots debate is simple. While Knots is not a fork and does not change consensus rules, the social dynamics resemble the early stages of past conflicts. If disputes escalate to protocol-level changes or widespread fragmentation in node policy, Bitcoin could once again face competing visions and potentially rival chains. The debate is still early, but history shows how quickly these tensions can evolve. The choices users and developers make today could shape how Bitcoin functions for decades. Running Knots signals support for stricter anti-spam policies, while sticking with Core reinforces a commitment to neutrality. If enough users shift in one direction, it could influence how miners, exchanges, and wallets handle transactions, ultimately affecting what kinds of data move through the network. If censorship tools gain traction, governments could eventually require certain filters, such as blocking sanctioned or politically sensitive transactions. That would alter how individuals in restrictive environments rely on Bitcoin and could make the network more permissioned than intended. But if absolute neutrality wins out, Bitcoin stays open to all forms of data, financial or otherwise, at the cost of potential blockchain bloat, rising fees, and a heavier burden on node operators. This could slowly price out everyday users and push the network toward a more elite, resource-intensive system. The generational impact is also very real. The direction Bitcoin takes will determine whether it evolves as robust, censorship-resistant digital gold, or becomes a more controlled system shaped by regulators and large institutions. Investors building long-term positions should pay close attention to node adoption trends, discussions on GitHub and developer mailing lists, and any signals from miners or exchanges. If debates escalate toward a possible fork, diversification and caution also become very important, though it's also worth remembering that Bitcoin has repeatedly weathered internal conflicts and emerged stronger. For newer investors, the most important thing is to stay informed without getting swept up in panic. Follow the key developers involved in this debate, including Luke Deshire, Andreas Antonopoulos, and the broader Bitcoin Core contributors. Expect volatility during moments like this, but remember that Bitcoin has survived every internal conflict so far. Running your own node, whether core or not, is one of the most direct ways to participate. It's a simple but powerful vote in Bitcoin's governance, and above all, keep sight of why Bitcoin matters: its immutability, neutrality, and user sovereignty. The choices made now help determine whether those principles remain intact for future generations. If you want to understand these debates more deeply and strengthen your long-term conviction, explore the educational resources available to you at learningcrypto.com. Thanks so much for watching. I'll see you in the next video.